But China now claims that even Genghis Khan was a Chinese. So they claim everything. But the Mongols ruled over Tibet, and thereafter Tibet became independent. The Manchus conquered China in 1720, but when the Manchu dynasty collapsed in 1912, Tibet declared independence. And Tibet was independent till 1950, when Communist China invaded Tibet again.
Timing is everything, it's said, and with the recent headlines about Tibet, the Dalai Lama, and the Chinese occupation of the roof of the world, there's nothing more timely than us discussing this book. The Imperial Games in Tibet, The Struggle for Statehood and Sovereignty. The author is Dilip Sinha, Ambassador Dilip Sinha. He's been India's envoy to the UN in Geneva. He's headed the UN division in the Ministry of External Affairs, as well as been Joint Secretary, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran. Ambassador Sinha, first of all, thank you so much for giving us time. And second of all, let me just put the book up there so it can be seen in one of our frames. And second of all, congratulations on the release of the book. I believe it is available both online and in bookstores, but there will be an official launch, I think, later in July.
Yes, that's correct. The book is available on Amazon. It's available in bookshops. But the formal launch will take place in a couple of weeks.
The book itself found extremely interesting and readable, Ambassador. One of the narratives that the CCP's narratives that you particularly demolish is what laymen or people who are not really researched into China and Tibet is that Tibet has not been part of China since ancient times. Correct?
That's true. This particular claim that China makes today, or Communist China makes today, is a very recent rewriting of history by China. Till as recently as the early part of the 20th century, China did not claim that Tibet was in fact a part of China, because in the Manchu Qing dynasty, Tibet was not one of the 18 provinces. It was part of the Chinese empire, ruled directly by the Manchus, not through as part of the administrative structure of China. So, and before the Manchus conquered Tibet in 1720. Now that's just 37 years before the Battle of Plassey, which was around the time Britain conquered India. China conquered Tibet. And before that, China had never ruled over Tibet. The first foreign power to conquer Tibet were the Mongols. But China now claims that even Genghis Khan was a Chinese. So they claim everything. But the Mongols ruled over Tibet, and thereafter Tibet became independent. The Manchus conquered China in 1720, but when the Manchu dynasty collapsed in 1912, Tibet declared independence. And Tibet was independent till 1950, when Communist China invaded Tibet again.
And in fact, there are points in history where Tibet has invaded and conquered parts or whole of China.
Oh yes, there was the leading dynasty of Tibet was the Yarlung dynasty, which had several rulers, ruled over Tibet for several centuries. And one of the greatest rulers of this dynasty was Songtsen Gampo, who was a very powerful ruler. And during this Yarlung dynasty, the Tibetans, in fact, had invaded China. And this was when the Tang dynasty, was a very powerful dynasty, was in power in China. And they had raided China. They captured the capital Chang'an, which is modern Xi'an, and they raided it several times. So there was a time when Tibet was a country powerful enough to take on China.
From history, we come to more contemporary developments, and that's why I'm saying it's very timely, this book. I'm sure it was a coincidence. You couldn't have predicted what is happening with so many headlines concerning Tibet. The recent visit of bipartisan U.S. lawmakers, Dharamshala, meeting the Dalai Lama, and then post that, even coming to Delhi, meeting the Prime Minister, the External Affairs Minister, the National Security Advisor. Now, the Dalai Lama post that has gone to the U.S. for treatment for his knees. So if they wanted to meet him, they could have done it there as well. So powerful symbolic messages, or more than symbolic messages, do you see it from both the US and India?
Well, this has been a very happy coincidence that the release of the book has coincided with the visit of this bipartisan delegation. it's very important that this delegation has chosen to come to Dharamshala, as you mentioned, days before the Dalai Lama himself was to go to the US. So this was clearly a message to be sent to China, not to meddle in Tibet. And then there's this new act, the Resolve Tibet Act, that is currently being passed by the US Congress, and it's waiting the president's signature. But equally important is the fact that after this delegation met the Dalai Lama, when it came back to Delhi, it also called on the Prime Minister and the External Affairs Minister. That's extremely important that the government of India did not shy of meeting this delegation. So both these are messages. India's message is a little more circumspect, as India has always been in its Tibet policy. But the US message is very, very direct.
You were talking about the act that has been passed again by both houses in the US. There have been two acts we were talking earlier, before in the US as well. There's speculation, I don't know whether it's informed or not, that possibly President Biden will sign it and meet the Dalai Lama on his birthday in early July. The act itself, why do you feel that it is so important?
Oh, the act is extremely important. The earlier acts that the US Congress had passed in 2002 and 2020, those were relatively mild. They talked about Tibet's right to its water resources, its environment. It talked about assistance to Tibetan refugees. And then it went slightly stronger and said that China should not interfere in the selection of the Dalai Lama, and anybody who does will face US sanctions. So that was there earlier. But in this present act, they have gone even further, and they have said that the status of Tibet is still disputed, and it will be settled according to the right of self-determination of the people of Tibet and in accordance with international law. Now, this goes really to the point where it says that the Tibet's status has to be determined. So the question about Tibet's international status that many people ask, since no government recognizes the Tibetan government in exile, which is in Dharamshala, but this particular act of the US will reopen this question that the world thought was a closed chapter.
A closed chapter, but there are those skeptics or realists, however you want to put it, who look at India-US relations and the current geopolitics, say, with the US and China and the great power competition there, who critique, if not criticize, India's position as saying we shouldn't let the US fire off our shoulder when it's a fight between them.
Well, that is precisely what the theme of my book is, imperial games in Tibet. Now, Tibet is a small country, and traditionally it has been a very reclusive country, especially after Buddhism came there. The monks who ruled Tibet wanted to be left alone. But the imperial powers did not leave it alone, whether it was Russia or China or Britain. Britain is now gone. Russia is no longer the powerful empire that it was, but it still is an important player. China, in fact, has become much more powerful than it ever was. The US was always a little distant from Tibet, and it was never clear about its policy. India's policy was also part of this game playing, where India felt that relations with China were far more important than worrying about these small group of people called Tibetans living in Tibet. So India always placed that higher. So did the US. So, for example, after the Second World War, the US did try to help the Tibetans when China invaded Tibet, but India dissuaded it, and India didn't cooperate. For a little while, they used Pakistani territory in East Pakistan to help the Khampa rebels. That didn't go too well. And eventually, China was able to crush the rebellion. And thereafter, as you know, there was a Sino-Soviet split. And American politics then switched over to geopolitics, where China was more important than anything else. So China became a close friend and, you can say, almost ally of the US. And again, the US had forgotten Tibet. Now, recently, there has been a downturn in US-China relations. So the US wants to reopen the Tibet position. So these are all part of the imperial games that countries play. But it's so much the better that for the people of Tibet, the fact that countries like the US are now prepared to stand up for it should be welcomed by them. And I hope that India also now starts revising its policy, relooking at it, and trying to understand that Tibet is an important neighbor of ours. And Tibet's interests do often coincide with our interests.
Just dive a little bit deeper into what you are mentioning, say, after China invaded Tibet and Tibet asked for international help, even went to the UN. Your book deals a lot with that and how India dissuaded, say, you were mentioning the US there. When you looked in this book on India's position post-independence, say, you point out, both because of not having the military muscle or the political will post the British leaving, couldn't pursue the same kind of policies that, say, the British were, say, for example, trading rights that we had with Tibet. If you want to touch about that in history, and then I'll come to more contemporary Indian foreign policy.
Well, historically, the position was that by the time Russia and Britain became major players in Central Asia, the Chinese Qing Empire, the Manchu dynasty that I mentioned, that dynasty was in decline in the middle of the 19th century. But both Britain and Russia were scared that if China collapsed, then the other country would get the bulk of this, the lion's share of the country. And neither was very confident of taking over all of China. China took full advantage of this to take their help to be able to crush there's a big rebellion inside China called the Taiping Rebellion, and they were able to crush that. And Britain and Russia decided that it was better to keep the Chinese empire intact. And in 1907, they had an agreement on how to divide Central Asia between them. And in this agreement, they decided that Tibet should remain a part of the Chinese empire. But by this time, the Chinese empire was about to collapse. Just about 5 years later, the Qing dynasty collapsed. But Britain remained and stood by its agreement with Russia not to recognize that Tibet was an independent country. However, they realized that they had to deal with Tibet, and since there was no Chinese control over Tibet, they dealt with Tibet directly, but they always maintained that fiction of Chinese suzerainty over Tibet. So they opened trade marts in Tibet. They did not open a mission in Lhasa because that was prohibited by the 1907 agreement. And it was only in 1936 that they finally opened a mission in Lhasa. But thereafter, when the British left India, they lost interest completely in this. And Russia supported China. It was the Soviet Union at that time. Remember, after Mao came to power in 1949, he went and spent 2 months in Moscow, where he got a treaty of friendship with the Soviet Union. And he also got Soviet support. And the first thing he did was to invade Tibet and take it over. Britain at that time had lost interest, and Britain stood by its agreement that China still had suzerainty over Tibet. India at that time had just become independent. We were busy with our partition, the war in Kashmir, our domestic issues. And also there was this threat of a war in the Eastern Front on Taiwan. And there was a threat of probably a world war. So Prime Minister Nehru felt that it was important to ensure that China did not go into a third world war. So he kept relations with China above the interests of Tibet. In the process, the US, which wanted to help Tibet, was also dissuaded by Britain. And when the Dalai Lama, when the Tibetan government appealed to Britain, USA, India, and the UN for help, nobody came to its aid. The UN took up the discussion, and the country that took up the case of Tibet in the UN was El Salvador.
Yes.
And there was a very perfunctory discussion in which India said that there is a possibility of peaceful negotiations taking place between Tibet and China. Since they are talking, let us shelve discussion on this issue. And the matter was shelved. And there it stands to date. So India's position at that time was that the invasion was wrong and the matter should be settled peacefully. And Tibet has autonomy, internal autonomy. Now, all this has been violated by China. So the basis on which India formulated its policy or other countries formulated their policies have been violated by China. And it is time to revisit the issue.
You mentioned it already twice about Indian foreign policy and how you think maybe this is the time that there should be a rethink. Has Indian foreign policy been too timid when it comes to Tibet because of the fear of provoking China?
Yes, I think so. I think so, because China has not had this kind of consideration. China, in fact, has over the years used its position in the UN as permanent member to get Arunachal Pradesh's status questioned. So if you look at maps published by a number of UN organizations, international organizations, they show not only Jammu Kashmir as disputed territory, but also Arunachal Pradesh. And while Jammu Kashmir has a historical, some history to it, Arunachal Pradesh is entirely China's doing. It is, there's no question of it being considered to be a disputed territory, and yet China has successfully managed to put it in the world as a disputed territory. And China continues not to issue visas to, or stapled visas to residents of Arunachal Pradesh. Given this policy of China, India should also take up matters of concern to it and major matters of security.
There's been some speculation in the media, though we've tried to independently confirm if there are any moves on India's part. Since you brought up Arunachal, the Chinese have been constantly renaming places, rivers, mountains, ranges in Arunachal Pradesh and in Tibet. And I think about 10 days back, there was a report about how they're doing it in Xinjiang also with the Uyghurs. This speculative report in the media was suggesting that India should also do the same in Tibet. Though, of course, it's not confirmed whether we are moving in that direction. Is that something that would move things forward? Or even if it happens, is it just symbolic again?
Well, fortunately for India, we don't really need to do anything except reaffirm Tibet's original names. Now, the people of Tibet have names for their towns. We respect those names. There's no question of our changing those names, except perhaps for mountains like Mansarovar, lakes like Mansarovar or Kailash Parvat, which have traditionally had Indian names historically, but Tibetans also have their own name. But otherwise, places like Lhasa and Gyantse, Shigatse, etc., they have Tibetan names, and those names should be respected by everybody. But China obviously does not believe in this. China has in fact renamed Tibet itself. It calls it Xizang, which is unknown to, the Tibetans don't call this Xizang. Nobody else calls it Xizang, but Chinese have changed their name. They call Arunachal Pradesh Zangnan. And even Xinjiang is a Chinese name for a province that has its own name, its own people. So India doesn't fortunately face this dilemma of not being able to recognize or appreciate or understand the sentiments of the local people who live there. But China wants to rewrite history all the time. It continues to do so. And then it will maintain that the name Tibet is a fiction, and Xizang is the real name.
And like you're saying, the narratives that are being sought to be built by the Chinese, they have to be countered. So not just in Tibet, we have to constantly reaffirm, though that's on the ground, it's already reaffirmed in terms of Arunachal Pradesh. But another myth that you kind of disprove in your book is the Chinese narrative of, when they talk about the century of neglect and humiliation from the Opium Wars till the Communist Party took over, those 100 years. They've set out a timetable for the next 100 years, how they retain or regain their position in the world. You talk about that as well in this book, saying China has been parading this narrative of being a victim of imperialism, whereas all through it has been an imperial power itself, and we see aggression of a different kind all over its boundaries even now.
Yes, you see, China calls that century between the first Opium War around 1840 and 1949, when the Communist Party took over, a century of humiliation. Now, to an extent, there was a lot of humiliation of the Chinese people, but we must remember that the Chinese dynasty that was ruling there was not overthrown. It continued to rule till 1912, and it was eventually overthrown not by Europeans, but by the Han Chinese people themselves. And then there was a massive reaction against the Manchus. Thousands of Manchus were killed in China when this Han Chinese rebellion took place, what was called the Chinese Revolution of 1911-12. So China was able to very successfully play various European powers against each other and continue to survive. After the first Opium War, there was a massive rebellion of the Han Chinese in China called the Taiping Rebellion. This is considered to be one of the biggest civil wars in history. China was able to control this because the British and the French started helping China, also the Russians, rebuild their army. There were British soldiers, army officers, who were naval officers, who were allowed to serve the Chinese emperor. And Britain amended its laws to permit its subjects and its serving officers to go and serve the Chinese government. And Britain particularly, but the other countries, Russia and France also, helped China, America as well. And they helped China not only crush the rebellion, but also reconquer the outlying areas that had broken away. Xinjiang, for example, had broken away. And these countries helped China recover. So the Communist Party just completely ignores this part of the narrative. And India, which had been conquered by the British and ruled by the British, is considered by China to be an imperialist, a dog of imperialism, but itself, which had, and they who had played with these European powers, they consider themselves to be victims of European imperialism. So that narrative needs to be understood. And we need to read a little bit more about the history of the country and also of Tibet to be able to understand why this current state of play how this current state of play has come about.
You talked, about the US Act and how it talks about the Dalai Lama's succession. Is very curt, if I can use the word there. How should that be dealt with? Because China is just waiting to install, like it has, somebody as the 15th Dalai Lama. And now that's a very crucial aspect of Tibet, isn't it?
Yes, that is extremely important because although the Dalai Lama has given up all his temporal powers, all his political powers to the Tibetan government in exile, the fact is that he's a very revered figure and every Tibetan leader looks up to him for guidance. So his passing away will create a void in the government, and it will also be extremely controversial because China is definitely bound to set up its own Dalai Lama, as it did in the case of the Panchen Lama earlier. Yes. So that process needs to be looked at, and the US has already done that. One of the US acts says that the Dalai Lama is a religious figure and his succession will be a religious issue to be decided by the followers of the Dalai Lama, and no other country or institution should interfere in this. And in fact, the act says that if any Chinese official interferes in it, he'll face sanctions from the US. Now, India has not taken a stand on it yet. I think India too should make its position clear that this is a religious post and it should be decided by the followers of the Dalai Lama.
It's quite ironic how the Chinese Communist Party deals with religion, because on one hand it's crushing it everywhere, the Tibet, whether it's the Uyghurs, all minorities there. But yet on the other hand, it wants to kind of usurp the powers, like by anointing a so-called successor to all these lamas. If you look at what happened just post the US lawmakers' visit here, I think Xi Jinping visits a Tibetan temple. And if I'm not wrong, he visits it in the province where the Dalai Lama was born, in Qinghai. It's also apparently where his father, Xi Jinping's father, met the 10th Panchen Lama, and the Sinicization of Tibet kind of happened. So the Chinese Communist Party, that distinction has to be clear, clearly fears religion in the long term.
Yes, the Chinese Communist Party has a very cynical attitude towards religion. It initially started by trying to destroy Tibet's monasteries, Tibet's cultural heritage. It destroyed almost all the monasteries, burnt all the books. There's a massive cultural decimation of Tibet. But that didn't succeed, because you can destroy books, but you can't destroy the hearts and minds of the people. And China realized soon that it was difficult to obliterate the Dalai Lama and Tibetan cultural heritage by simply destroying the monasteries. So they started using religion, and they started anointing lamas. And they said that anybody who wants to be called a lama or a reincarnate lama must get a certificate from the Chinese officials. So there are many people in Tibet who would be quite happy to go and apply saying that they were reincarnate. And the number of reincarnate lamas in Tibet has gone up many-fold because the Chinese officials are taking money and declaring people to be reincarnate lamas. So this is a very cynical way of looking at religion, but they are trying to destroy religion either by destroying it physically or by making such a mockery of it that it loses its sanctity and solemnity in the minds of the people of Tibet. But they're also trying to cynicize the religion and the people. They have taken almost 3/4 of the students of young boys and girls of Tibet into boarding schools where they are being taught only Chinese and not Tibetan culture and language. And even youngsters as young as 4 years old are taken to special kindergartens. So this kind of an attitude is both to destroy the Tibetan culture and make a mockery of religion to a point where people start disbelieving it.
And we were talking about how it's probably a necessity for India to also do a rethink on its public posture vis-a-vis Tibet. You mentioned the naming of Tibetan places in local language, maybe even making its position on the succession of the Dalai Lama clear. Anything you think that we should be looking at in terms of the One China policy? I know since 2010 it's never been publicly articulated even in bilaterals, but or do we hold back till we need it for some later period if and when there's a conflict with China?
Well, there is a misconception about this concept of One China. But this One China policy relates to China's relations with Taiwan, which is the Republic of China. And here, when the US de-recognized Taiwan or Republic of China and recognized the PRC, the People's Republic of China, at this time, there was this concept that you can recognize only one of the two governments of China. That is the One China policy. This has nothing to do with Tibet, which is the case of annexation. Here the question is Tibet an independent country which is under the illegal occupation of China, or is it a part of China? Now, India's position so far has been that it's an autonomous region of China, which is what China's position also is, unfortunately is, or cynically is, because China calls it the Tibetan Autonomous Region. But here the point is that India's policy has been mocked by China, which has abolished the autonomy of Tibet. Tibet is ruled by the Chinese Communist Party. We know what kind of government it has. So in this situation, it is time for India to revise and relook at its policy in the light of the fact that its earlier stand is no longer valid. And that is true equally of countries like the US. Britain, of course, will continue to stand by its old agreements, and in any case, it's basically inconsequential in Asia today. Russia, we don't know what kind of stand it will take. Right now, Russia is very dependent upon China because of the Ukraine war. But the deterioration in US-China relations has fortunately been a boon for Tibet, because the US has started relooking at Tibet and is making its policy stronger. For India must remember that India has been trying to look at its relations with China and trying to resolve its differences with China by talking about the border. So border talks have been going on for the last 30 years. No progress has been made. We've seen what happened in Galwan, where China violated even the most basic agreement that we had, which is that the patrol parties would not carry any weapons with them. And for 20 odd years, this was respected by both sides until China very brutally killed our soldiers, taking them by surprise. So even that little basic agreement China has not respected. But the important thing is that even if by some miracle we are able to resolve the border dispute with China, what about Tibet? Tibet will always remain a factor in India-China relations. We must remember that China will not trust India as long as the Dalai Lama or Tibetan refugees are on Indian soil. We have seen how China reacted to the visit of this delegation, of the US delegation, to the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama calls this whole setup the Dalai Lama clique. And in China is always suspicious of India. And whenever Tibetans protest either inside Tibet or in India or anywhere else in the world, China suspects India to be behind this. So we have to remember that Tibet is the let's say the elephant in the room when India and China are sitting, and we have to address this problem.
But even addressing it, if you want to just round up your thoughts, I mean, you've done so much research into history, Indian history as well, and how things are changing in the current scenario. Are all these moves, in any case, symbolic in terms of Tibet regaining its independence? Or does it need the CCP to collapse? Or even if the CCP collapses and something else happens? I know I'm speculating here, but what will it take for Tibet to be independent again?
Well, 70 years is a very short time in the history of nations. Nations look at centuries. Right now, China is on an upswing. It's a very powerful country. So the idea of Tibet becoming independent would be a dream today. But it's important that countries like India continue to support the Tibetan cause. People in India continue to read about Tibetan history, Chinese history, to understand what this problem was all about. And also to speak up for at least the human rights of the people of Tibet and help the Tibetan refugees build their institutions so that as and when the time arises for Tibet to reclaim its position as an independent country, then they are in a position to do so. And the narrative that Tibet has been a part of China since ancient times, that narrative should be firmly buried, and Tibet's history should be known to the people of India as well as the world.
And in that light, one final comment on how Tibet and India have helped preserve each other's cultures, languages, documents, books, which we are doing currently, which the Chinese are doing just the opposite, destroying it there. But that's happened in reverse in the past as well, right? You were mentioning that earlier.
Yes, you see, India and Tibet have had very close relations. Now, even before Buddhism traveled to Tibet, there were close relations. But once Buddhism traveled there, then India was considered by the Tibetans to be the land of the gods. And Tibetans would come to India, study in India. When Nalanda University was set on fire by the invaders, a lot of books were taken from Nalanda to Tibet and preserved there until people like Rahul Sankrityayan went to Tibet and got those books back. Now, when those books were brought back, they became safe in India, whereas in Tibet, they were destroyed by the Chinese invaders. So we have had this relationship of helping each other mutually, both because we are close neighbors and also because of this great religion called Buddhism.
Ambassador Dilip Sinha, again, thank you so much for your time, and thanks for this book. I'm sure it must have been years of toil and research that you've done to come up with a very lucid and readable book. Thanks and congratulations again.
Thanks to you for having me here.
Pleasure, Ambassador. And do give us your feedback on this interview. You can, of course, follow our social media handles for the latest that we put up on our website, or interviews like this with Ambassador Dilip Sinha on our YouTube channel. This is Stat News Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.